Hi everyone, this is Danny Hartung with my Module 9 case study presentation. So first we'll get started with sort of a summary of the case and what is happening. And as we go through this presentation, anything highlighted in yellow is something that I will be sort of referring back to or using as support for my analysis of our NELP standards for this module. So our summary of the case, we read about Assistant Principal Richard Inman being faced with this dilemma because he sort of spends a lot of his personal time outside of school hours fostering relationships with students that he knows are perhaps troubled or would be more likely to be influenced by the negative outside factors that are happening in the community. And he knows about these factors because he grew up in the community himself. So the students who perhaps are succeeding or who don't need as much personal attention or prevention in this way, he doesn't have quite the personal relationship with, but it is clear that he takes his job very seriously and he's working to make the school district a better place for all students. So what happens on this particular day is that James, with whom Mr. Inman has a personal relationship because he's sort of greasing the squeaky wheel, I guess you could say. James has a history of negative behaviors, and Richard is trying to decrease those behaviors by getting to know the student on a personal level. And this has been working. He's been doing much better, but recently he's had a lot of unexcused tardies in class, and so he gets reported to the principal. And out on his way to the office, he comes across another student, David. This student is much physically smaller. He is more of an academically minded student, a musically minded student, an honors student who's very highly involved in the school and has no history of misbehavior on his record. So in this short exchange, James pressures David into taking a pair of brass knuckles from him and threatens him with physical harm should he not comply. This is so that James doesn't get in trouble for having this weapon in his possession when he goes to the principal's office because he knows this will result in expulsion. So he threatens David into taking them. David complies out of fear and does take them. And a teacher sees this exchange as well and reports both boys on suspicion of drug possession taking place or an exchange taking place. So the policy states that if you have a weapon such as brass knuckles on your person, you should immediately be expelled for 45 days from the school and also are subject to questioning and arrest by the police. So the ethical dilemma here is they weren't David's brass knuckles. He was threatened. He wasn't complicit of his own accord in this illegal activity. And also, as a side note, James admitted to the police officer that they were his brass knuckles and that he had threatened David. So he had sort of come around and done the right thing, but at that point, in the police officer's eyes, it was too late, and both boys were arrested and taken without legal or parent representation present. So lots of issues going on here, both on the legal and ethical side. There may already have been harm done to David. He was physically shaking and crying when the police officer was interrogating him, and he didn't want to say that they were James's brass knuckles because, of course, they had been interviewed and interrogated in the same room. So we're expecting this young middle school boy to not only accuse someone of forcing him to take part in this illegal activity, but we're asking him to accuse that person who's sitting across the table from him in the room where he had just been threatened to be hurt if he hadn't helped this student to by taking his brass knuckles. So this case really makes me think of the spirit of the law and the letter of the law and the distinction between the two when we're making these gray area nuanced ethical decisions. So not only could there already have been damage done to David's psyche, but also he might be subject to much further damage should Richard choose to follow through with the expulsion, even though James or David is technically a victim of James's actions and behaviors. So the school district has this zero tolerance policy that is supposed to prevent this violent behavior and these weapons on the school campus, but this might be effective for students who actually are bringing the weapons onto campus. But by just saying that if they're in your possession, you're automatically expelled, this creates a victim like David, and it breaches his social contract because he has done everything right up to this point. He has no history of misbehavior, he has no history of illegal activity, and this one situation, he was barely allowed to give a statement before he was arrested and questioned by the police. So this is a very touchy subject, I think. He has been reprimanded and harassed by his principal or his assistant principal and by the police, and he's been coerced and threatened on the other hand by a bully. So he's kind of between a rock and a hard place, and there's nobody advocating for him at this point until his mother is notified of the incident after the fact. So also on a continued note, I do want to state that policy is created with good intent in mind. So we create policy so that we can demonstrate integrity. We want for our school to be known as an organization that holds students accountable, that is treats everyone equally, and that sort of maintains these consistent expectations for student and stakeholder behavior. But the problem is ethics require us to focus much more on equity than on equality. We can't treat every situation and every student the same, and zero tolerance policies are really inflexible in that way. So some of these messier, more gray area situations, such as this one, they just really don't jive with zero tolerance policies, and that's one of the reasons why these types of policies can be so harmful. We can also determine by looking just at the surface level of this case that the two situations are not the same. And so not only is the policy inflexible, but it also doesn't allow for any sort of professional deference or situational deference on the part of the administration. So my short and sweet synthesis of this case study is the assistant principal is faced with the frustrating decision between following protocol, which he gets the phone call in order to pressure him to go ahead with the expulsion and follow the protocol and the policy that's in place, and by some stakeholders who probably would be upset if he didn't follow through consistently. And integrity, which he's trying to uphold. He's fighting with himself because his integrity says that he should protect students, he should protect David and his family. And so in this perspective, we also, or in this situation, we know perspective largely affects one's perception of what is right and what is the best decision that he could make. But in order to weigh the pros and cons of this situation and of his possible decisions that he could make, we know that Richard is faced with the fact that he could lose his position by doing the best he can to do his job, which is to personally connect with, model ethics for, and protect the students that are in his care. So he's actually kind of faced with this double-edged sword. In order to do his job, he could risk his position, which would not allow him to continue to do the job. So our known facts of the case, in terms of people, we know that this assistant principal is very highly focused on relationships. He knows that there are lots of outside influences in the community, and he knows this on a personal level, that could push students toward illegal or illicit activity. It happens all the time. It's very common. It's customary in this school district. And so he feels a kinship to these students. He kind of knows the struggles that they're facing, and he wants to model for them a positive influence that not only cares about them personally, but also lives with integrity and models consistent ethics. So we also know, though, that he doesn't have ultimate power in the school. So even though he's doing all this work, he still ultimately answers to the board of directors. In terms of place, we can probably assume this is in an urban community. The school district size, or the building size, this is just junior high, is very large. And we also know that crime rates are high, and there is a high history of violence both in the community and the influential area, and also within the school, which is the reason why we have this policy that you're expelled if you bring lethal weapons onto school property. We don't know exactly the place, exactly where this situation is taking place, but we know that the zero tolerance policy indicates that there is a history of violence. The school appears to be publicly funded. It is at the junior high level with 900 students, and that can make it difficult for Richard to get to know each student individually, and we see that by the fact that he's only had one conversation with David. We don't know much about student demographics, but we could assume that there is a high range or a big range of opportunity levels, and we know that because David appears to have much higher academic and musical opportunities, things like AP classes, whereas James's mother was kind of relieved almost that he got thrown into jail and either couldn't or was not willing to go and pick him up immediately. So in this case, we need to take a look at the perspectives of all important stakeholders. So it's clear the board of directors values sort of this iron fist mentality. Our policy is there for a reason, and we need to be consistent and have integrity, or these students and their families and the community won't take us seriously. But in order to make the most informed decision for Richard, we need to know a little bit more about his past history. Does he have a good relationship with the board of directors, or has he been obstinate in the past, excuse me, disregarding school policy that was already in existence. We also need to know more about the demographics and the history and the community of police and student interaction. If there's a high level of violence, perhaps the police are involved a lot of the time. And so we need to know, was there a personal relationship, a personal history there between David and the police officer, or between James and the police officer? And so in order to make the most informed decision, it would be helpful to have some of that information, because it would tell us more about the stakeholders like family, community members, police officers, and Richard himself. So our three options here for Richard are to just go ahead and follow the board-approved protocol. This is by the book. He could just do what he's told, uphold the policy, and not ask questions. Second would be to outright refuse to comply. So he could just say, no, I'm not going to. I consider this student innocent, and it goes against my own ethics to expel him, so I won't. It will definitely get him reprimanded and may get him fired. And then my third creative option was to fight to retroactively amend this policy. So we keep the policy in place, but we make changes to it to allow it to be more equitable, so that it doesn't result in the expulsion of an innocent student. So the pros of compliance are that I won't receive a reprimand. The cons are that it goes against my personal ethics, and it could cause likely damage to David and his reputation and future. To refuse, the pros would be that it protects David and brings the flaw of the policy to light, and the cons would be that it would result in my reprimand and probably a tarnished reputation in the eyes of the board. To alter, this is my creative solution, alter the policy would make the policy more realistic and equitable and demonstrate my deep thought and consideration instead of just disregarding the policy altogether. But the cons are that it can't probably happen quickly. I have to go through the chain of command, and it could still tarnish my reputation. By choosing the best option, I'm illustrating not only my own professional ethics, but my personal ones as well. So I'm refusing to accept that this innocent student should be reprimanded at the same level as a guilty one, but I'm just not showing obstinance toward the board and a disregard for existing policy. I'm showing deep thought and research so that I can take all stakeholders' perspectives and opinions into consideration. So the board of directors, David and his family, James and his family, and the community at large all need to be on the same page. The school is still acting with integrity and with ethics, but we're doing such that we're causing actions that would allow that to be much more equitable. So if I implement this decision, the fallout could still be great. So that's the other thing about these gray area ethics decisions. We could still receive negative fallout even though we do the best that we can. I could still be reprimanded. I could still be fired. Damage to David has already been done, so we've got to deal with the fallout of that. But for the time being, I think it's on a need-to-know basis. Only David's family and my board of directors need to know until that information is released to the community by the board. It does involve legal action because we involve the police, so we also need to include them in any new and amended policies that we make, because they'll also be held accountable for upholding them in the future. According to my personal ethics and my moral compass you see here on the screen, if this action were failed or to be dismissed or denied by the board, I would feel it my own personal responsibility to submit the expulsion and go through with the policy as it stands. But if I did that, I would also submit my letter of resignation effective immediately. So this module standards help us to take a deeper look at these difficult gray area ethics and apply it to an actual situation that happens to educational leaders. We're not only recognizing these breaches of ethical behavior, but we're also advocating for change. So we have to notice them, be able to identify them, and also stand up for the students who are being harmed by them. And then standard 2.3 helps remind us that not only do we need to cultivate these personal relationships, but we also need to model ethical behavior for our students. So Richard does a great job of this. He spends time with students, he knows their needs, he attempts to encourage them through modeling, but he also needs to stand up for this ethical policy. He realizes the system is broken, he needs to do something about it. So this assignment really brought to my attention the need for creative reflection and door number 3 options. I think it would be really easy to assume that he could either comply or refuse, and those 2 options, neither one really sat right with me. So I think it's important for us to take collaboration and creativity into account when making these nuanced decisions of ethics, and I'm going to take this into my future, both modeling it for my students and allowing them the opportunity to mull over gray area ethical dilemmas, but also to uphold that and advocate for change when it's needed. All right, that's all I have to say about this module. I've enjoyed this class and all the learning that we've done together. I can't wait to hear what everyone else has to say, and best of luck the rest of the semester. Bye-bye.